All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the WGSN-DB Going Solo Veterans Corner. I am your host, retired Army First Sergeant Paul Holbert, coming to you live from Northern Virginia. And we want to thank our audience for joining us tonight on a show where we try to connect military veterans from across the country with our audiences, allowing them to share their experiences, their lives, their careers, and what they're doing now with other people in the country and other veterans. So I want to thank you for joining us. Before we go any further, though, I want to take a moment just to thank the sponsors of our show. We have two wonderful sponsors, Quest Jewelers of Merrifield, Virginia. So if you're one of those people looking for some very quality jewelry or a very excellent custom-made piece, you can contact Pete and Juan Tain, the owners at Quest Jewelers here in Merrifield at questjewelers.com. And you know, Mother's Day is coming up, so this is the perfect time to take a look and see what they have for you. Our other sponsor is Nationwide IT Services. Nationwide IT Services is a service-disabled, veteran-owned 8A small business certified by the Small Business Administration. And CK Park and his professional team of management, IT, training, and assessment specialists are there to help your company in whatever business needs you may have. So I encourage you to contact Nationwide IT Services. You'll see their website and number across the screen during the show. And we want to thank both of our wonderful sponsors of our Veterans Show. Well, let's meet tonight's guest, Air Force veteran Captain Bill Eastham. Bill spent part of his military career in a number of assignments, managing airspace operations at Osan Air Base and doing, I believe, was air traffic work at Dover Air Force Base. But interestingly enough, Bill was also a missile crew commander for the country's Minuteman ICBM system. So that should be a little bit of interesting conversation. He holds a BA from the University of Virginia, a Master of Science from the Wilmington University, and a PhD in organizational psychology from the Kennedy School. Now, he and his wife currently reside in Northern Virginia, and he just retired not too long ago. And I think he's trying to figure out what his next steps will be, because as I'm sure Bill will tell you, that anytime we get into, you get these ex-military folks, it seems like we never quit running, do we, Bill?
No, and thank you, Paul, for having me on this evening. I want to also remind you and thank you. I enjoyed working with you back some years ago. As we just discussed, it's probably been 10, 15 years ago that we worked together for a couple of years. But as you said, I'm looking, as I have pretty much stepped back and retired. I'm still doing a little bit of work, but I still haven't figured out what it is I want to do when I grow up.
Yeah, we seem to have that problem. I'm looking at retiring again probably in about 2 more years, and I'm trying to figure out just how much effort I want to exert after that fact. But I know that you started early on in the Air Force, and I want to talk a little bit about some of what you did, but kind of share with us, how did you get in? What prompted you to go into the military?
It's funny. I've been asked this question a few times as I've moved from company to company, and it's a story I've told a lot. And I'm glad my wife is not here, because this would have probably been the 10,000th time she's heard this, because I sort of ended up in the Air Force almost by accident. It wasn't something I had planned. I was a second-year student at the University of Virginia, and I was doing a project for one of my classes. And part of it, I was a communication major and a sociology major. And one of my projects, I was to interview the senior officers, the colonels that were in charge of the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force detachment. And I went to the Army and I went to the Navy, and my last one was the Air Force. And I met Colonel Miller, and I was chatting with him. I thought, well, this is the Air Force. I'm going to mention to him that I have my private pilot's license that I got when I was finishing up high school and in between going to my first year to college. So we got to talking, and I don't remember a whole lot of the conversation at this point, but I do remember walking out of there with some papers, and I spent that summer between my second and third year in school at this lovely place in San Antonio, Texas called the Medina Annex.
Yeah.
And in the middle of summer, it gets really hot for the 6 weeks I was there to catch up for not
Yeah.
having been an ROTC student the first 2 years.
Yeah.
But then I spent 2 years in ROTC, and because of these, being a pilot in the Air Force was out of the question. And so I got selected into the missile program and spent, when I went on active duty and there was a little bit of delay with that, I spent another 4 to 6 months in Vandenberg Air Force Base in the missile school there before I went to F.E. Warren Air Force Base.
Yeah, and I have to say, I just need to throw this in at you. The Army might have still taken you as a helicopter pilot, possibly even with some glasses. Just a thought,
I should add to that the lady I married, Wendy, her father was an Army colonel, and he still let me marry his daughter.
Oh, well, that was nice of him, I have to say.
Yes.
But I know that you mentioned something interesting, and I know folks out there listening would definitely be interested. This is something a little bit from the past, but I know you got into the missile command system with the ICBMs, and can you share a little bit of that with us? What was that like?
Well, since you invited me to share some of the background as a missile launch officer, keep in mind this was in the late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah.
And the Minuteman III was the primary platform that was at F.E. Warren, and actually still is, even though they went through a small period of time where they had the MX, or the Peacekeeper, which is no longer in use there. They went back to the Minuteman III. Basically, after about 4 to 6 months in training at Vandenberg Air Force Base, you learn everything about the capsule that you spend your time in. It's 90 to 100 feet underground. There's in the Minuteman system, there is a capsule that has all of the equipment in it and a very large, about 10-ton blast door. Then on the other side of the facility, there is an equipment room that has air handling equipment, emergency generators, air filtration systems, water filtration systems, all of the apparatus that you can isolate yourself with. There's obviously an elevator shaft and another blast door that's another good 10 tons of blast door. So once you get in your little cocoon, your little egg, and it really is kind of an egg-shaped drum-like thing that you're in, there's lots of equipment. And when you go through training, you basically learn how all the air handling system works, how the emergency generator system works. There's another emergency generator that hangs under the floor with batteries that, if I recall correctly, were like submarine batteries that we were using as another backup power system. And we even had a bed in the capsule for when you could take naps when they went where one of the crew members were allowed to sleep after they went through a process of allowing that. But the other thing is then you learn all the communication systems, and there were tons of them, and I've probably forgotten half of them. But everything from HF, UHF, Ultra UHF, there was SLFCUS, which was Survivable Low Frequency Communication System. There was something I think called SACS, which was another communication paper-based system. And then EWO, which was Emergency War Orders. And that's, for some reason, where a lot of folks didn't do as well. The equipment side and the communication and all that, everyone did really well in. And then after that training, you go to your assignment, and mine was to F.E. Warren. And you spend probably about another month really getting oriented and going through simulator training and additional training there for the local community. And then you pull your first alert where they, your commander, if he's smart, really keeps an eye on you for the first couple of weeks.
Yeah.
One of the things that stood out to me is that, what is that expression about we train as we fight and we fight as we train?
Yeah.
In the missile system, because of what it involves, there's not a whole lot of room for error. And under emergency war orders, when messages are transmitted and whatnot, there's not a lot of room for error. So the expectation was you were going to get 100 on every one of those tests.
Hmm.
We weren't quite as concerned about whether you got 100 on the air handling or the emergency power, but you still were expected to do very, very well on all of this. But once I got to F.E. Warren, I think I acclimated fairly quickly and spent alert time. And in general, your month would be, especially as a deputy, you would spend anywhere from 6, 7 alerts per month, which was a 2-day. You would go out in the morning, come back the next morning. So you're a 24-hour shift, so to speak. There was a topside crew that spent 3 days out there. So the security teams, the cook, the site manager, your flight security officer. It's amazing that a lot of these acronyms are coming back to me. But the flight security officer, they were out there for 3 days at a time, but the downstairs crew was there just for 24-hour shifts. And so you would go out, and most days it's fairly routine. You sit there, there's a lot of message traffic, there's a lot of communication that goes on with the day-to-day operation. When there's maintenance on site, and I'm probably not going to recall all this exactly, but each of the LCCs at F.E. Warren, there were 20 launch control centers, and then there's 200 Minuteman missiles, so each capsule controls 10. And by the way, a lot of this has changed because in my day, the capsule configuration was the crew commander set up front and was perpendicular to the deputy. And the spacing between them, because you've seen on TV, and actually it's been very well done on TV several times, there's a key insert. You both have to simultaneously turn the keys. And now I notice that in the new configuration for the new redone capsules, they're actually side by side. So anyway, that's changed. But when there's maintenance on site, it can get a little crazy in terms of there's a lot of security protocol, there's a lot of maintenance protocol. When you take a strategic missile off alert to go into maintenance, there's a lot of things that have to be done and a lot of coordination that has to be done before that can happen. And so there's a lot of processing on the facility. And then if you have someone who decides not to authenticate properly, that creates a whole nother issue. And then you've got to get the security alert team out there to, physically inspect the guys to make sure they are who they say they are. And
let me just say something here, because you're right. You're right. People have watched, on TV, they've watched the movies and that type of stuff. And that, I think the reason why that job still fascinates people is because, the simple, well, how can I say, the simple impact of it, knowing that you may have to, as you said, turn the keys and, actually launch those missiles. So I would imagine there was probably a good deal of stress involved with that.
there is. There's a program for missile launch officers called PRP, Personal Reliability Program. Yeah. And so you do go through some screening and whatnot. And there's also at least a TSSCI background clearance that you go through to be a missile launch officer. I assume most of that is still in place. I'll skip ahead based on what you just said. As obviously declassified and made national news several times, there were a few events back in the 80s where mistakes were made in calling out that this was the time of the Strategic Air Command, sent the DEFCON up and what we called postures up.
Mm-hmm.
I had the unfortunate pleasure of being on one of those.
Mm.
And it's interesting because you don't really realize that you can kind of follow through in the training simulator, you have a fair amount of time. There are time constraints on everything, but you have a fair amount of time to go through the procedures you have to go to effect launch. And you always think, you're right down to the wire and you get it. But you find out very quickly that when it happens in real life, it takes next to nothing to do what you've been trained to do, which is why I made that point of, you train as you fight and you fight as you train. But I will tell you, there were a few folks that after one of those episodes decided that missiles was not the thing for them.
Yeah.
And it just, again, it gets back to the PRP, and you're right. There can be a lot of stress, especially when you have 2 or 3 sites that undergo maintenance, some planned and then something goes wrong. They normally wouldn't do that, but if they already have some planned maintenance that's going on and then something else happens with another LF, a launch facility where the actual missile sits, and normally the missiles are, at least 3 miles away from the LCC. We used to make a joke, and only folks that have done this would probably find this humorous, but there used to be a joke that it wasn't the blast that would kill us, it was the fall of the capsule to the bottom of the hole that it left.
Yeah.
And even now, after not being in that for so time, I'm not sure even I see the humor in that. But for
that's what they used to tell us too about jumping out of planes. It's not that first step in that fall that'll kill you if it doesn't open. It's that sudden stop at the bottom that does it. So yeah, very similar. Well, you also, I know you kind of finished your career out doing a lot of air traffic type of work, both in Osan and Dover Air Base, and it's in having had your pilot's license, I guess I can see, how you got into that. But as you worked in those areas, what did you find different as you moved into those areas?
Well, it was interesting. And I thought about this after we chatted about me discussing this. It was interesting that I went from missile launch, which, as I said, most of the time it was very routine, except for those times when it wasn't. In air traffic control, which is what I went into next because I didn't want to stay in the missile field. And during that time at F.E. Warren, because as you advance up and I became, I think it's called select crew and elite crew, I was only pulling 3 or maybe even 4 alerts a month. So I had a lot of free time to get involved in things. So I didn't want to stay on that side. And I actually was going to get out. And someone called me and offered me, would you like to go into air traffic control? No. And I said, well, air traffic control, if I become an air traffic control officer, that might set me up to work with the FAA when I get out. Yeah. So I went through air traffic control school, which oddly enough was a year long, and you get the same credentials that an FAA air traffic controller gets: control tower operator and RAPCON operator, radar approach control. And I went into that, and as I reflect back on it, what they both have in common is that there is, aside from a lot of procedures, they're both very exacting jobs. There's not a lot of room for error in either one of those, especially in air traffic control. And I think what most folks don't realize, and again, I'm assuming it's still the same way, the Air Force bases that have REPCONs, they are part of the NAS, the National Airspace System, and they control as many civilian aircraft as they do military aircraft for the most part. So again, the standards are exacting, and the training is also pretty, as I said, the air traffic control school that I went through at Tyndall Air Force Base was a year long. And so you not only have to become a certified air traffic controller, you also have to learn to manage the complex and learn all of the equipment and all of the systems that handle the RAPCON and the control tower, the radar, the communication systems as well. And it always fascinated me. I would never have really considered myself an air traffic controller because that's not what my primary job was about, even though I did have to be certified, and I did get my CTO at Dover. It always amazed me that as I look back on it, air traffic controllers that I worked with in the Air Force were probably the most professional folks that I worked with throughout the time I spent in the Air Force. And it always fascinated me that a guy could stand there and listen to 7 or 8 conversations in their ear and keep it all straight, and pushing, all kinds of channel hopping between the various radio frequencies and keep everything straight. And while I was at Dover, unfortunately and very sadly, Dover Air Force Base is the recovery base for deaths in the European theater. And we did a lot of the body recovery from the Beirut incident. And we had a very massive ceremony there. And we also did the Gander Newfoundland recovery from the plane that went down. And during the Gander Newfoundland is when we had the really large ceremony. And we had folks come in, because I was about to mention we also had the Canadian folks come down as well. And there must have been 26 to 30 VIPs, level 1 VIPs, vice presidents, senators, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Prime Minister of Canada. There was a whole host of folks that took about 2 hours to get there, land, various planes, helicopters, everything. And I'm in the control tower watching all of this. And the senior master sergeant, who was the control tower chief at the time, Sergeant Redhill, never will forget him, Chief Master Sergeant Redhill, by the time I left, he sort of turned to me and he says, yeah, getting them down on the ground is not going to be the problem. It's when they're all going to want to leave at one time that's going to create a problem.
Everybody's in a hurry.
The air traffic control was very much, again, similar. A lot of training, working with a lot of folks. The folks there were, as I said, some of the most professional folks I worked with in the Air Force. And several of them went on to go to OTS, Officer Training School, and transition from the enlisted ranks to the officer ranks. That was the other thing that I think we actually had a pilot that got upset because he got turned around one time when he was coming in to land, and there was something on the runway and he got turned around. He got very upset, and he came to the RepCon. And I think it was the first time and I think it was a major, realized that the air traffic controllers sitting in the facility were all enlisted personnel.
Yeah.
And he then started fussing about that as well. And I never will forget the chief of the RepCon had a few choice words for him as security escorted him out of the RepCon. But I spent a little over 3 years at Dover Air Force Base. And again, aside from learning TERPs, which is Terminal Instrument Procedures, Combat Airspace Management, all of those things came into play, which is how I ended up in Korea. But
we're gonna take a short break right now, and when we come back, I want to continue the conversation with you because I want to talk a little bit how you've been kind of interesting even after you left the service, and you've had a pretty, how can I say, a pretty high level professional career. So I want to talk about that a little bit too. We're going to take a break right now, and we'll be right back with Bill right after our break. All right, welcome back everyone to the WGSN-DB Going Solo Network, and we are on the Going Solo Veterans Corner with our guest this evening, veteran Air Force Captain Bill Eastham, and we were talking a little bit about some of his Air Force experience, which was pretty interesting, but I actually want to kind of um, move into talk with Bill a little bit about more of his civilian career after the Air Force, because Bill, I know, moved into, started getting into consulting and management in a variety of areas, and has worked for a number of companies. So, Bill, why don't you share that a little bit that with us and tell us what it is you were doing? I think you might be muted.
Yeah, we went through that the
There we go.
first time I logged on.
There we go.
I wanted to back up just for a second because I thought of something when I was stationed at F.E. Warren. Most of my my entire military time, I lived in base housing. And another thing about being stationed at F.E. Warren was I got to live in quarters 1, which was one of the oldest houses on base, and it was an absolutely gorgeous home. And it was next door to quarters 2, which after I was there about 6 or 7 months, the current occupant was Colonel Gilmore, uh, invited me over and we chatted. And quarters 2 was the home that was assigned to, at the time, General, I can't think of, Pershing, Blackjack Pershing.
Yeah.
And so I got to obviously see that home and everything, but it was sort of also nice in the fact that you're living in base housing that in the context of F.E. Warren was very historical, going back to the late 1880s, early 1890s. And it obviously transitioned from an army to an Air Force base, one of the few that does not have a runway. My transition to the civilian world, my last jobs in training were as director of training for air traffic control training in the Air Force, and what was then TAC, Tactical Air Command, and TRACALs, all of the equipment for navigation. And so when I transitioned into the civilian world, I went into training and basically management of training programs. And by then I had earned my master's and had done some other work, both in social work and some other things. And training was what fascinated me because, again, as I mentioned earlier, I saw that the exactness of well done training made an impact on not only how people performed, but how people progressed as well, which leads, into good management if you're promoting your folks and making sure that they get the training and even the educational experience that they need to advance and to do their jobs better. And so I first transitioned out and worked for a number of companies. I've worked for Booz Allen, SAIC, the Syntec Group. All have been in change management, training, and planning, organizational type issues. And I've very much enjoyed it. The one thing that I did pick up from the military, as you know, you get to change jobs every 2 to 3 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what I found was after I did something for a while, it didn't necessarily hold my attention as much. And there was always something else I could go do if the opportunity was there. So I did move around quite a bit. As I mentioned earlier, you and I worked together at Windwalker for a while, and I was there. I think that's the longest I actually ever stayed anywhere. It was about 5 years there. And then I managed to, in one of my last jobs, I worked for a company called A-List, which doesn't exist anymore. It was run by General Abrams, John Abrams. And it was a service-disabled small business, and we did contract work for the VA. And again, all that was transformational leadership. So that also helped me take some of the project management and quality management that I had been into and move into leadership development and leadership training. So we did in the federal side, there's SES, Senior Executive Service. And so we put together a training program for Senior Executive Service for the VA as well. So I spent a lot of time doing that. And after having avoided becoming a federal employee all of that time, my actual last job involving the federal government was as the manager of training for the U.S. Postal Service for about a year. And the Postal Service is an interesting place. I worked there for about a year. It's a fairly large staff. It runs not only the Bulger Academy and then the training academy that's out in Norham, Oklahoma, where they do a lot of their operational training. But there's about 600,000 postal employees that you do training for everything, how to sort mail and how to use the machines, to all of the stamp. I mean, it's just anything you can think about that is involved in the Postal Service. And I don't think most folks realize the amount of automation that is involved in handling the mail. But there's services where you can actually be told what your mail delivery is going to be in the morning. They'll send you an image of everything you're going to get in your mailbox the following day now, because everything is photographed that goes through the mail system.
Yeah.
And but all of it has been training and education, change management, and leadership, because that's what I've enjoyed doing.
Yeah.
And I do find working with folks, I'm still doing some mentoring and coaching with folks that I've worked with in the past 10 years from 3 or 4 different jobs. And I also find that rewarding. And it's building those relationships, which I really picked up, I think, from the Air Force, because you learn to rely on others to get things done. You don't get things done by yourself. You get things done by how you can work with others to really accomplish things. And I think that's something that a lot of people lose sight of there. And it took me a while to learn this. This wasn't something, that I picked up in the first couple of years in the Air Force, but you really don't accomplish that much by yourself. You accomplish so much more by building those teams. And that's what I really learned how to do in probably the last 10 or 15 years of my career. But I enjoyed, I spent a lot of time in federal law enforcement, using my background in what's called paracommunication or metacommunication. A lot of folks refer to that as body language, micro expressions. Did a fair amount of work with a number of agencies. Worked for U.S. Customs for a while in their anti-terrorism and anti-narcotic systems. Again, training folks, training staff, developing programs. There were a lot of programs that were developed that automate processes for how cargo, something as simple as cargo coming in and out of the country, which is just, again, a phenomenal amount. That was back in the late 1990s, early 2000. We were already handling petabytes of information on a daily basis. And you've got to learn how to sort through that and develop programs and work with people that understand how you categorize all of that stuff so that you can pick up, possible misshipments, contraband, narcotics, and that type of thing. So
let me ask you this, though.
Yeah.
You had a long career. You spent those years in the Air Force as a veteran. Coming out, you had a very long professional career. In a lot of these areas, you work for a number of large companies. You're finally retired. So what do you, for the most part anyway, I know at one point you were contemplating moving down to Florida to be near your daughter. So have you guys decided what it is you're going to do now?
My wife hasn't let me know what we've decided. How's that?
Yeah, that's probably about the truth.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I've been spending some times with a number of associations. I'm active in the American Society for Quality, the Training Development World, ATD. So I enjoy doing that type of volunteer work, if you will, as well. Um, I'm not sure that moving to Florida, I've spent most of my adult life here in Northern Virginia. I was born in Virginia, went to the University of Virginia, as 5 generations of my family have. And I'm not sure that moving out of Virginia is necessarily in my future.
Hmm.
But I think there's a thing called a snowbird where you
Yeah.
go down for the winter and you come back for
Yep.
the summer. That's also a possibility. But I do know I want to get back involved. I've been doing very little for the last 2 years. And I think I've gotten to the point where I do want to get back involved, and just had a physical, and apparently I'm good at least until my next physical. So I
So
think there's
you're rip roaring and ready to go.
but you made a remark earlier about, I think when you come up through the military as you're first starting your career, the discipline that you pick up in that, and I hate to use the word workaholic,
Yeah.
but in our generation, uh, you sort of become defined by what you do. And because of my Air Force experience, when you are brought up in an environment where there is high standards and a lot of training, and you then pursue that throughout your career, retiring to where, I'm doing reading and writing, but that's not the same thing as being involved in other
Yeah.
folks. So I'm
Yeah.
sure I'm going to get back into something. Someone jokingly said I should get into politics, and I said, nah, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But I'm sure
Well,
there's
you know
something
what?
out there.
I was going to say, as you talk about politics, getting into politics, I want to ask you because, you've done so much, you've experienced a lot. You know, I want to ask you about a final thought here. If you had one final thought that you could share with either our other veterans or just the audience in general, if there was something that you wanted to share, what would that be?
It took me a little while, and I think it wasn't through planning. It was just through being in the right place at the right time during some of my military career. But as I transitioned into the civilian world, I think the one thing, well, multi points probably. I think the military does give you an excellent foundation in terms of building that work ethic, that involvement, that cooperation that you need. But I think the thought that comes out most in my mind is to pursue something that you will enjoy doing, that is a
Yeah.
part of you, that you can put, it's not a job, it's something that you've selected to do because that's what you want to do, that's what you want to pursue. And I've done a number of generational studies, and one of the things with both the millennials and the Z generation, millennials, normally we think of these age groups as being defined by the age group that you belong. But I remember reading more than once that with millennials, it's about a state of mind. It's not the age bracket that you're with. But as I've done those studies, I see that the millennials and the Generation Z are about pursuing more of what you can do that is part of you versus just
Yeah.
doing something different for a job, 9 to 5. Although I don't think I've ever had a 9 to 5 job. But
So as opposed to just making a living, doing something that you feel is meaningful to you, I think is what you're trying to say.
exactly,
Yeah.
do something that has meaning for you, that you can enjoy or you can truly engage with, something,
Yeah.
something that you can see as being part of your happiness versus I do this so I can go over here and do this other thing that makes me happy. And I've talked to folks in multiple job titles that have done everything from electrician to doctor, and it's amazing that they selected it because that's what they wanted to do. It wasn't because they felt compelled to it, in terms of folks that were very satisfied with the careers they've had.
Well, Bill, I got to tell you, yeah, I mean, that's good advice, because you definitely want to enjoy what it is you do. So work is more than just work. I also want to thank you for taking the time to come on the show and talk with us this evening and share your military experience and some of the other things that you've been doing with your life. And just like a lot of the other veterans, you've kept busy.
Oh,
And
yes.
again, I want to thank you for coming on and sharing with us. And we wish you luck as you continue on with whatever it is that you're going to do in retirement. And I hope to be talking with you again soon.
Yeah, maybe I'll buy an RV and just tour the country.
That might be a good idea. Thank you, Bill. I
Yeah,
really
sure enough.
appreciate it.
Take care, Paul.
All
Thank
right,
you.
thank you. And for those of you still out there in the audience, I want to remind you, as we do with every show, that there's information available and help available out there to our veterans. And this might be a little bit of a sensitive subject, but it's one we still have to think about. The VA National Cemetery Administration, for those of you that are either veterans or loved ones of veterans and family members, we invite you to take a look at the VA National Cemetery Administration, their website. You can see it on the screen, because as veterans, those veterans have earned certain rights as far as burial and assistance from the VA. So, while again, it's not a subject that everyone is happy to talk about, it's something we still have to think about as our veterans continue to age, especially those in our families. So keep that in mind. Take a look at it. The information is up there, and they'll be more than happy to help you. So I want to thank the audience tonight for listening to the WGSN-DB Going Solo and the Going Solo Veterans Corner. And we want to thank our guest tonight, Army Captain Bill Eastham, for his information and sharing with us as our guests do. Veterans, we want to thank you for your service, and we hope that you are striving to continue to live your best life. I'm your host, retired Army First Sergeant, and we invite you to come back to our next show, where we hope to see you again. Thank you and good evening.